It doesn't always come easy. But let's give him a nice, warm welcome here to Southwest Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Is this mic here working? You can hear me okay back there? All right. You know what the real irony of that story is, Jerry, and I don't tell very many people this because it's something out of the past that, you know, I've tried to distance myself from. But, you know, in high school, a lot of time you have nicknames. You know who I was in high school? I was Dog Garish. Dog was my middle name. There were people in, and this is a small school. I had, I think, 22 in my high school graduating class. By the time I was a senior, you know, freshman, sophomore, of course, they don't know anything anyway. But there were people who didn't even know what my actual first name was because I was so much known as Dog Garish. So that's funny that you would use that particular story. All right, so yeah, it's a pleasure and honor to be here in Virginia again. Virginia, there's a number of people here that I know from over the years, some who came all the way out to Missouri and attended our 4-day grazing workshops there many years ago, probably back in the early 90s, I'm guessing, on some of you guys. And we were kind of sorting it out. It's probably been at least 10 years since I've been to speak about grazing in the state of Virginia. Hopefully, I've got a few new things, but a lot of it's going to be what I've been talking about for years and years and years because the basic needs still haven't changed. The other thing I want to say is Virginia actually is one of those special states to me. My mom was from Virginia. She was born in Norfolk and grew up in Northern Virginia and then around Maryland. And my grandmother lived up that way. And back in the 60s, every other year, you know, we'd come to Virginia for a week to see the relatives back this way. And so I remember that Herndon, Tyson's Corner, Drainsville area, when it was nothing but open farmland. And that's still the way that I like to think about good old Virginia. So what we're going to do today, we're going to, myself and then the other speakers, it's all going to be focused on extending the grazing system. And some of you have already told me the progress that you've made. You've sold the hay equipment. You aren't feeding near as much hay. Some other people in this crowd might still be wondering, how on earth do they do that? Some of you might have been thinking, why would you want to? So we're going to start out with the why would you want to on year-round grazing. And these, the whole technical difficulties at the onset of this was we couldn't get what they call the aspect ratio correct on the projector. So everything's going to look kind of short and fat because it's still stretched out sideways rather than being normal. So those bales haven't settled that much, and those aren't really that short and dumpy a cattle is what they look like. They might be a little short and dumpy by some people's standards, but not as extreme as what they look like. So here's the beginning premise. And this is based on actual producer records, actual cow-calf records from these three states: Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi. From the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, right down to the center of the U.S., on average, cow-calf producers all feed the same amount of hay. Yeah. Why would they do that? Let's think about Minnesota. If you talk to a Minnesotan, very often he's going to finish his sentence with A. They play hockey. They drink really weak beer. For all practical purposes, they're Canadians. Being Canadians, they certainly have a little bit of right and privilege to feed hay. I mean, that's the great white north, snows up out there, all that. Sure, they could feed 130 days of hay, and that might seem perfectly reasonable. I know a few cow-calf producers in Minnesota who feed no hay. Haven't for years. Let's go down to Mississippi. And let's go clear down to the Gulf Coast, where a cold day in the winter is 48 degrees. Warm season, not warm season, cool season, annuals like ryegrass, oats, rye, turnips, basically they grow all winter. Why would you feed hay down there? And I know producers in Mississippi who feed no hay. And then we can go to the middle part of the country, to Missouri, the Garden of Eden of grazing, in which, by the way, I always tell people, if my life's ambition was solely to be in the cow business, I never would have left Missouri. Our move to Idaho was a recreational lifestyle move. So Missouri, I know lots of guys and gals who graze year-round and feed no hay. Now, if you believe in normal distribution and the bell curve and all that, for every producer in Missouri who feeds no hay, theoretically, there has to be someone who's feeding hay for 260 days. And you know what? I'm pretty sure I knew some of them, because there's folks there doing that. So why on earth, when you have that much difference in climate and condition, does everybody feed the same amount of hay? And I think basically we feed hay to the extent that we can make hay. Let's go back, let's say about 170 years. And let's think about making hay. And how 170 years ago did you make hay? Well, it was hand labor. You made hay by having a family with 9 kids and good neighbors. That's how you made hay 170 years ago. And then there was a little invention came along called the sickle bar mower. And you could get behind your team of horses, sit on that little cart, and you would have this 3-foot wide mowing machine running along beside, and then they made them 4 foot. And then 5 foot, but we had to put another horse on them. And we could mow hay down without swinging that side. And we got rakes that the horses could pull. And lo and behold, we got steam engines. And you could take a baler, you still carried the hay to it and forked it in, but it compressed it into bales, and you poked little wires through some holes, and it tied it in a knot, and you had a bale of hay. Wow! And then the baler started rolling on wheels. And we finally got to this point right here. And I ask this question at every meeting, and only rarely does someone ever remember. In the 1970s, what was Vermeer's marketing slogan? Anybody remember? The one-man hay system. We had gone from needing a big family, good neighbors, bunch of horses to making hay, to the one-man hay system. And unfortunately, there was no gender equality in those days, so it's not the one-person hay system. But it could have been. A woman could have run all of that equipment, and it could have been the one-woman hay system. That is how easy we made hay. And that's why we make a lot of hay. And if you make a lot of hay, you're going to feed it. Now, that was the slogan in the 1970s. And we've come further into the future. Most of you have probably heard, you've seen it, it's been hammered into you. People come and do these winter forage meetings and they tell you, winter feed costs money. And if you look at most cow-calf budgets from anywhere in the country, and you look at what the #1 line item cost is, I will give a hint right now that 2004 to 2007 it was actually something different in many operations, but for the most part, it's winter feed. That's the biggest cost we have. Why do people continue to feed hay? I think this is one of the reasons right here. It's because they have no idea what it actually costs them to do that. And Dr. Greg Halick from the University of Kentucky, be on the program later this morning. He's going to walk you through understanding what it actually costs to make hay. He's also going to walk you through how do you figure the cost of grazing and then be able to make a comparison. But most people, and I'll ask this question here. How many of you in this room, first off, do any of you make hay? Any of you make hay? Don't be shy, you know. I did it for years. I did it for years. Okay. Can any of you tell me within $5 a ton what it costs you to produce a ton of hay? Can anybody tell me that? We got a few people who can. That's good. Now, sometimes I'll ask, how many of you can tell me within 5 pounds what your average weaning weight on calves has been in the last 3 years, we'll say? Anybody know that number? Don't put up your hands because I don't want to embarrass you now. Because it doesn't matter. Weaning weight has very little relevance to profitability. Cost of hay has tremendous relevance, and we'll look at that just here a little bit later on. To put things in perspective, in 1973, my dad bought what was one of the first 605C Vermeer balers in the state of Illinois, and we did custom haying. I paid for my first 4 years of college almost entirely from the custom hay business. I paid for equipment, I paid for school, I paid for some travels. So I'm kind of I was into hay in those days. That baler cost $4,200. Now, in July of 1973, there was another event took place that has relevance in our industry. And that was we established the record high price for finished cattle and calves to that point in American history. Fed cattle in 1973, July, hit a price of $54 a hundredweight. Wow. Anybody remember the housewife beef boycott of 1973? When normal American housewives, not long-haired, freaky, not creepy, they're not creepy at all, actually, once you get to know them, but no, long-haired, freaky California hippie women, no, it was normal American housewives picketing the Kroger stores, the IGAs, refusing to buy beef because it cost too much. If you take the ratio of the price of that baler to the price of beef, it'd take about 7,800 pounds of finished beef to buy a hay baler. Let's jump up to 2012. And I meant to change that last night. I didn't even notice till I put this up. That's not $1.28 a hundredweight. That's $128 a hundredweight, or $1.28 a pound. But last year we hit a new all-time high record beef price, and we're going to exceed it this year. But $128 a hundredweight, 605M model baler, $40,000 plus or minus. If you have a good relationship with the dealer and you don't get a lot of bells and whistles, you can probably get that baler for $34,000, $35,000. If the dealer hates your guts and you get every feature possible on the baler and he really sticks it to you, it might be $45,000. But let's say it's $40,000. Again, take the ratio of the value of beef to the cost of the baler. It now takes over 30,000 pounds of beef to pay for that baler. We can do the same thing with pickup trucks. We can take about anything you want, and it just takes a heck of a lot more pounds of beef to pay for it today. 1973, we were paying 17 cents a gallon for farm diesel. I can remember it being as low as 13 cents in my working years. There was something else happened in 1973 too that was significant. Anybody remember what that one was? The first Arab oil embargo, and fuel prices skyrocketed. A little bit later in 1973. Some of you old guys also will remember that 1973 was followed by the most precipitous crash of cattle prices that we ever experienced. And anybody who survived 74 and 75 knows what that part of the cattle cycle was like. Farm labor. When I first started working off the farm in the late 60s for other farmers handling little square bales, idiot cubes as we called them, I got paid $1 an hour. When it went up to $1.25, now I'm getting rich. Farm labor, if you can even find it today, and I didn't ask anybody in Virginia yet, $10 to $15 an hour, is that what you would pay for day labor? Is that a reasonable price? You can't get them at that. Well, I wondered about it. So labor costs a lot more. Nitrogen fertilizer, 9 cents a pound, 54 cents a pound. You look at the percent increase, 950, 2,000, 800 to 1,000, 600%. Then we look at those good old cattle prices, record all-time cattle price, little over twice as much as what it was in 1973. All of our inputs have increased 4, 5, or more fold in this 40-year period. The value of our product has increased much, much less. What made economic sense in the 1970s and what made sense in the 1970s based on the relative value and price of product and inputs, it made perfect sense to bale up everything you could, feed as many cattle as you could, and do all that because it paid. We don't live in the economy of the 1970s anymore. We are in a whole different era. But how many, I won't say of you, because I'm sure you're not, how many of your neighbors are still operating in the economic paradigms of the 1970s? A whole bunch of them, because when you drive up and down the road, that's what you see. People who are still living in the 70s. This is some work done from Dr. Alan Williams at University of Illinois. This is not the Alan Williams that some of you have read about in, grass-fed beef discussions and animal genetics and stuff. This is a different Alan Williams. This is a nice piece of data set because he looked at some interesting things, and there's another number. That one I did change. I don't know why it's back. There's not supposed to be a minus sign there. But this is Illinois SPA or SPA, Standardized Performance Appraisal. This is a standardized beef record-keeping system so that you can evaluate the performance of your herd and farm against other operations, regionally, nationally, within scale, different things like that. And this is divided up by the top 15% profit cow-calf producers, the bottom 15%, and then the 70% that are in the middle. If we look at some measures of profit, one of the common ones is return on investment, ROI. Top 15%, and this is ancient history before, big prices and cost inputs and all that. So maybe you don't want to believe it, but we can look at data from the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, to, I've got a set of Wyoming and Northern Plains data that is current through 2010, and you see the absolute numbers change, but the basic relationships stay the same all the way through. The most profitable producers make double-digit return on investment every year. It doesn't matter where you are in the cattle cycle. It basically doesn't matter a whole lot of things. They make a very good return on their assets. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a set of producers who lose net worth every year. They have to work off the property, sometimes a couple of jobs. It started out just the wife goes to town and gets a part-time job. Then she gets a full-time job. And then the man goes and gets a job. And then you have to start farming your kids out to work for somebody and siphoning off part of their pay. You call it, well, we feed and house you, you ought to pay something. What it's really doing is just another under-the-table way of subsidizing piss-poor cattle management. All right. Which, by the way, Jerry didn't say that I often get to the point and say what I mean. And I might offend somebody here. And I used to have a whole lot more people just get up and walk out. People are more open-minded these days, it seems, and they tend to stay around a little bit longer. All right, so we have these numbers here, and yeah, people who make more money generally people who make more profit generally bring in more money. Well, that makes sense. But let's look at the cost side of this situation. The top 15% and annual variable cow cost at about $267. The least profitable 15%, $480. Over $200 difference in operating costs. Well, that's pretty significant. You look at a lot of the numbers these days, and they're up $600 plus or minus. I've seen some states where they're around $700. In the commodity beef business, your costs are always going to rise to meet the income. It's just the nature of the beast. Of that $200 difference, over $100 of it is in feed costs. Now, Dr. Williams then took 8 different parameters and evaluated how do they affect the relative profitability across this set of ranches. So what makes you different from your neighbor in terms of profitability? At the top of the list here, way above anything else, is feed costs. 57% of the variation in profit from one farm to the next is explained by nothing more than feed costs. A lot of people, your neighbors particularly, are probably interested in selecting bulls with high EPDs for higher weaning weight, yearling weight, so we can wean heavier calves because, oh, in the end we sell pounds, it's got to matter. Less than 5% of the variation in profitability can be explained by weaning weight. Put it another way, when you're thinking about management, when you're making management decisions on what's going to affect the profitability of your business, it's 10 times more important to be thinking about feed costs than it is about weaning weight. Now, some people say, well, we've got these small herds and they're hobby herds and we're always going to lose money. There's no way that you can be profitable with a small herd. Here's herd size. Less than 1% of the variation in profitability is explained by the size of the herd. There are small herds that lose a lot of money. There are big herds that lose a lot of money. There's small herds that make a profit. There's big herds that make a profit. It doesn't come down to just get big or get out. It comes down to all the other things that you do to deal with primarily feed cost. Now, Greg's going to spend a fair bit of time looking at costs for various scenarios of operation and talk about the profit potential in these. So I'm just going to blow through real fast the agronomist's interpretation of profit. Simple concept, income minus costs. All the money that comes in, all the money that goes out. We could weave other things into this, but I'm going to keep it simple at that point. You have 3 basic ways to increase income in a cattle operation. You can increase units of production, run more cows, run more steers. And I always put this one up from the standpoint of if you have 50 cows right now and you're losing $100 a cow, what's getting 60 cows going to do for you? Just make the hole deeper faster. Now, if you're making money on every animal that you produce, doing things that will increase your stocking rate can be valuable for adding units of production as long as the cost of accomplishing that does not exceed the value returned. Receiving higher prices per unit, going back there to the 1970s. Were there grid markets for cattle in the 1970s? Was CAB, Certified Angus Beef, an ongoing entity at that time? And all these other branded labels that we have now. In the 1970s, there were no premiums in the beef business. All you did was try to avoid the discounts. Now there are real premiums in the beef business, and you can make changes in your management, or maybe it's just changes in how you market your animals, and you can get more per unit of production. We can add enterprises that might help us utilize an underused part of the ranch or part of the solar panel, the total forage production. You know, if 50% of what you're growing is brush and the cows aren't eating it, you could throw goats in there as another enterprise. capture more of that solar energy that your farm is producing and market it as another component. You do have to avoid the risk of getting so diversified, so many enterprises, that you can't manage any of them effectively. The other way we can increase profit is by reducing costs. And we have overhead and operating costs. Greg's going to talk a lot about this. There's opportunities for reducing both of them if you approach extending the grazing season in an organized and thoughtful manner. You can't manage the costs if you don't know what they are. So you do need to have good accounting of what your inputs truly are and then address where you have the problems. Okay, there was a survey that Beef Magazine did. Oh, it's been a few to several years now. I can't remember exactly when it was. But, you know, Beef Magazine's a nationwide publication. They have these polls from time to time. And the question on this one was, what do you spend most of your time doing around the ranch? So it's an assessment of where is your labor going. Number 1, making hay. Number 2, feeding hay. Number 3, nursemaiding cows, which means spending a lot of time with them in calving season. And then we have fence building and maintenance and irrigating. You guys here don't worry about irrigating. When I moved from Missouri to Idaho, we went from a 38 to 40 inch precipitation zone to a 6 to 8 inch precipitation zone. So irrigating is kind of a big thing for us. Okay. I always think about the farm and ranch as a business. Some of you might willingly admit that, oh, it's just a hobby, I'm doing it for fun, it's a lifestyle thing. But if you think it's a business, let's actually think about it that way. If you had, and let's say you have 30 cows and a bull, maybe 2 bulls, a few younger animals around, replacement heifers, stockers. So maybe we have 50 employees. Oh, every animal on the place is an employee, and they all have jobs to do. If you were in town and you had a business with 50 employees, you would likely have something that we call a position description for your different employees. And this is something written up that tells the employee what their job is. Equally as important, it tells the manager what that employee's job is. Has anyone ever written a position description for a cow? You should try it. In a lot of our workshops, that is one of the exercises, is write a position description for a cow. I'll tell you that the first line on my cow's position description is, rustle your own grub. It is not my job to find her feed. The second line is find the best bite of feed that you can. It's not my job to put something in front of her to be the best bite that she can find. If you go out every couple hours when you're calving heifers and you're checking on them and you have all kinds of facilities and you spend most of your waking hours, which are greatly reduced in calving season than in normal time, and that's what you do on a regular basis, there's something fundamentally wrong with your genetics, with the time that you're calving, and it's a dysfunction in your business. In the operation we're in now, that we don't calve cows at our place, we're high elevation, and they send pairs up in the spring. But the last several years that I was in Missouri with our own cows, I never went out at night and checked cattle. We did pull a few heifers, and they were promptly out of the herd. It's probably about the 5th line in a position description that says, deliver a live calf every 12 months. It doesn't say that have your midwife help you have a calf every 12 months or so. It says deliver a live calf every 12 months. If a cow can't do that on her own, she needs to be terminated as an employee. Most of the time that people spend in the cow-calf business are doing jobs that the cow's supposed to do. Now, we get down to fence building and maintenance. I've never seen a cow put a fence up. I've never seen a cow repair a break. I've never seen a cow reel up a piece of poly wire. They can't do that. I've not even seen a trained cow who could do that. So that is our job. So there we are. Out of the first 4 main jobs, only one of them is something that the ranch manager is supposed to be doing. Again, going into the context of broader business, what is the role of a manager in a business? What's the role and function of a manager? Okay, I'll tell you what I think it is, because I'm a real touchy-feely, warm, sensitive kind of guy, so I express it this way. The role of a manager is to create a working environment where your employees can thrive. Very often I have people say, it's to make sure the employees are doing their job, or it's to make make an employee do this, make an employee do that. To me, no, that's not what it is. It's create an environment where your employees can be the best that they can be. Our job as cattle managers is to create an environment where that cow can be the best cow that she can be, to do her job effectively. In my consulting business, we look at a lot of people's financial records, and we look at their costs. And guess what? Most of the time, the highest cost that we find is winter feed. What might surprise you, and Greg's going to follow up on this in great detail, within that winter feed component, because we'll break it out into what factors are actually contributing to it, the number one factor that we find for creating this high feed cost is equipment depreciation or equipment ownership. It's simply having the equipment is the biggest cost. And then we have fertilizer, and Greg's also going to talk about fertilizer, and he's an economist, and he's going to point out some difficulties in the concept of using nitrogen fertilizer. And again, for you guys it doesn't matter, but irrigation. We find labor to be a high cost. And in this half of the country, we have a lot of cow herds that aren't very big, 20, 30, 40. In some areas, 100 cows is a good-sized herd. Maybe there's a couple hundred, maybe there's 400. And we have to ask, well, how many cows should one person be able to take care of? Or we might say, what's an appropriate number of cows for a mom-and-pop operation? I know people who have 100 cows and have a full-time hired hand. Okay, well, that's interesting. If you go out to the successful ranches in the West, places like Deseret, Matador, Padlock, they expect every employee to be responsible for 800 to 1,000 cows or equivalent stock units. And you might say, wow, how on earth do they do that? And then you go to Australia. The national standard in Australia is 1,500 cows per employee. The most successful ranches usually run about 3,000 cows per employee. So why do some outfits with 100 cows have a full-time employee, and yet others expect one person to take care of 800 to 1,000 cows? We go back to the previous slide. The successful ranches don't make hay, don't feed hay, don't nursemaid cows. Now, in the U.S., culturally, we deal with a cow who's having calving difficulty still as a cow, and we try to help her out. And we try to get the calf up and going, but then we might just ship her away. You know what, in Australia, how do you deal with a cow with calving difficulties? Anybody know the solution, the Australian solution? You just shoot her. Culturally, in this country, we don't do that. Our neighbors, our friends, our city cousins, kind of wouldn't let us do that. But that's what assisting a cow with calving difficulties in Australia means. You shoot her. So there's labor. We could probably be more labor efficient if we didn't make hay, feed hay, and babysit cows. Now, it kind of looks like I have a blank line in here. And that's the number 2 cost that we frequently see. And from 2004 through 2007, with a lot of our clients, it actually became the number 1 cost, a higher cost even than winter feed. Does anybody have any idea what that might be? Well, somebody said equipment. Nah, that comes under the winter feed typically. A lot of people think it's a made-up fantasy cost that economists talk about just because they don't really understand how the cow market actually works. They understand better than most of us do. It's cow depreciation. Just the loss in value of a cow from the time you either raise the replacement heifer or you buy a cow. She has some calves. She comes up open and you sell her as a cull. And generally selling her as a cull is a lower price than when you bought her new, right? Okay. Just to kind of put this in perspective, how many calves does the average beef cow in the United States have in her lifetime? Anybody know? 7. I hear a 7. Anybody else want to suggest anything? I hear a 3. Who said 3? Good man. It fluctuates from the years, but it's going to be somewhere between 3 and 4. In very good times, it's as high as 3.7. In years where there's kind of problems across the country, it might be 3.2. But that's the range that it's in. That's all the calves the average cow has in her lifetime. We all remember the 12-year-old cow who's bred every year and has given us 11 calves. We tend to forget all the first calf heifers that ended up open, the 3-year-olds that fell out, and then all the other maladies until... If you have a bunch of 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old cows, they are pretty good cows. But it takes a lot of dropouts typically to get to that position. Man, he's finally going to get around and talk about grazing. All right. I just wanted to set the stage for why year-round grazing is such an important management tool in the cow-calf business, really in all cattle business, and with sheep, and with goats, and with bison, and with elk, and probably even with alpacas. It doesn't happen by accident. Year-round grazing takes year-round planning. Your strategy for how you're going to get through the winter of 2014 without feeding hay, grazing the whole way through, needs to begin before the first blade of grass turns green this spring. We start out by knowing what is our seasonal forage supply. What do we have available to work with? And we can think in terms of the different classifications of plants and when they grow. We have cool season grasses, things like fescue and orchard grass and bluegrass, that produce a lot in the spring, not much in the summer, come back in the fall. We have warm season grasses, things like Bermuda grass, big blue stem, broom sedge. Broom sedge is a warm season grass, a native warm season grass. We have forage legumes that grow different times of the year. It's kind of a funny line. I don't know if I believe that every day. And we can have winter annual grasses that, well, they start in the fall, get established, and then they come in the early spring. One thing that chart should suggest is the more diversity you have, the more different plant types you have on your farm, the broader the grazing window is likely to be. If you only have warm season grasses, you got very restricted opportunity. If you only have cool season grasses, you have restricted opportunities. So the more of these that we can grow, the broader the potential growing window and the subsequent grazing window. There's a technique that I use that we call a pasture inventory, and we have more and more of our clients doing this on a regular basis. And what the pasture inventory is, I go across all of our pastures every 2 weeks, look at them, and estimate what the forage supply is. Now, when I was in the research business for years, we clipped lots of quadrats, you know, the little metal frames, and then you weigh and dry what you cut out of there. We also measured height in there. And you can do an inventory if you want based on clipping, which would be horrible to do. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. It's tedious, expensive, and oh man, don't clip quadrats. You could do it by measuring the height, and I think on the VFGC book sales table, I think they also have some of those grazing sticks. And on that grazing sticks, there's a little table printed on there that tells you that for every inch of height that you measure, there's so much yield. And so you can measure the height of pasture and estimate from that. Or you can get to the point where all you do is you look at it and say, well, that's 47 cow days per acre, and go on. Say it with enough confidence and people will believe you. And you say, well, what's a cow day per acre? A cow day is what one cow eats in a day. For me, because I've spent most of my life around about 1,200 pound cows, and if we think about a moderate level of intake, 2.5% body weight, 30 pounds. 1,200 pound cow eating 2.5% of her body weight is 30 pounds. So for me, a cow day is equivalent to 30 pounds of forage. Well, how did I know there was 47 of them there, or 43, whatever I said? I think it's actually 46. How did I know there was 46 there? Because we do this inventory and then we set up our strip grazing, our daily paddocks, based on what we think is there. So if I had just happened to have a herd of 46 cows and I fenced them into a 1 acre strip and left them for 24 hours, came back the next morning, if the pasture is just at the perfect residual, the cows are happy, they look full, hey, I'm good. But if I come back and it's pool tabled down to a 1/2 inch, wow, I guess that was only 30 cow day per acre grass. And I adjust my eye. And if the grass is left quite a bit bigger than I expected it to be, well, maybe that was 60 cow days. So we make that adjustment. If you do that, if you do daily moves with temporary electric fence for 4 to 6 weeks, each time you do it, estimating what you think is there, and then looking at the results in 4 to 6 weeks, your eye will be statistically as accurate as clipping those quadrats. So we don't measure height on anything. We don't clip anything. Everything we do is visually estimated. So I've got 450 acres of pasture under the 2 center pivots. I have 90 acres of flood irrigated land. If I'm doing the flood also, if I'm doing only the pivots, it takes me about 35 minutes to ride the ATV around, looking at each of the pastures and doing this estimate. And from that, we create something called a grazing wedge. And this grazing wedge is, my individual pasture identification numbers, and this is cow days per acre available in the pasture. And the grazing wedge just ranks from highest to lowest what I have available. Hello. There we go. And I do one of these every 2 weeks, and this is our projection for what our grazing management for the next month is going to be. And is it worth doing? In the 8 years that we've been managing this ranch unit in Idaho, which was already one of the better managed ones in the valley, we've increased the carrying capacity, the total number of stock days harvested per acre, by about 70% through monitoring and managing. And again, emphasizing it was already a well-managed unit. We average about 250 to 270 stock days per acre harvested from the irrigated pasture. All right, so this blue line that says optimum, that's what I would like a pasture to be at when I put the stock in. So I'm going to put the cattle in number 21, and it's a little above the line by the time I come out here. And each of these, even though we move every day, these typically represent about 3 to 5 grazing days. So it's unit 21, but I might split it up in 3, 4, or 5 one-day strips. So by the time I get out of this, 18 is going to have grown up to the line, and it just works out. On a grazing wedge, if most of these bars are hitting at or near the white line, which runs from 0, and 0 is not bare ground, 0 is the appropriate residual, up to the optimum. If it's hitting there, that says you're in balance. Your stocking rate, the number of animals you have, is matched just perfectly with the forage supply that you have. And so we can use these to look 2 to 3 months out into the future. We see whether the supply is going down, is it going up, is it staying the same, and that's how we do our fine-tuning of managing. That's a whole half-day workshop on doing these. All right, so the last inventory of the season, of the growing season, tells us what we have available to work with through the winter. And parts of Virginia are a little different, particularly when you get to the southeast, where fescue, as I understand, fescue will grow almost all winter. It might be growing very slowly. Tell you a little bit about where I live. We live at 6,000 foot elevation, central Idaho, 45-degree latitude, so we're just as close to the North Pole as we are to the equator. There's been a weather station at May, Idaho since 1941. In the 70-plus years since that time, there are 2 calendar dates on which it has never frozen. Those are July 26th and July 27th. The other 363 days of the year, sometime in that 70-year period, it has frozen on every day except those 2. So you might call it a little bit of a harsh environment. The only thing that makes it work, for this deal here is irrigation. So we have a distinct end to the growing season. It's not going to grow beyond, basically October 1st. Sometimes September 15th we're done. Very, very rarely can you actually measure any growth beyond October 1st. So we have a distinct end to the growing season. What we have on October 1st is the feed supply that we have to work with through whatever time we need to keep stock there. Now, we're not content. I don't do this piece of it anymore because I have enough years of tracking the change over winter to know what we lose each month to just weather deterioration. We also feed elk and deer out here. Not deliberately. It's kind of a cafeteria deal for them. They just come in and eat what they want. But we count animals. All of our windows have binoculars and scopes at them, and we regularly count the animals that we see out there. And yesterday, the producer-presenter was talking about, somebody asked the question, do you have problems with deer knocking down your fences and stuff like that? He said, oh yeah, I had 14 deer, running through there, and they knocked the fence down. We typically see, 200 plus or minus deer out there, and then the elk will be anywhere from just a dozen to 70 plus. But we've kind of figured out how much the critters eat. We know what we lose for weather, and we plan accordingly. Yeah, we plan accordingly, budget out the feed, allocate it out. All right, the next thing, once you've kind of figured out what do you have to work with, then you need to figure out, okay, what kind of animals at what time of the year do I need to have out there? And that brings us to the concepts of stocking rate and carrying capacity. Stocking rate is it's the number of animals you put out there relative to the land base. Carrying capacity is a refinement of the stocking rate. It's the stocking rate that provides a target level of performance while maintaining the integrity of the resource base. What that means is it's a stocking rate that allows you to make money and do it year after year. So that's what we're really interested in, is the carrying capacity of the property. Stocking rate is what you put out there. Carrying capacity is what the land will bear. Important concept here. What does it say? Why should stocking rate be the same year-round when carrying capacity is not? You have times of the year when you could run a lot more animals, times of the year when, man, it's just hard to get by with what you have. This is where the idea of flexibility of the stocking rate comes into play. Sometimes we talk about the head slap moments. Wow. What totally changed the way we did our cattle business in Missouri is when I realized this principle right back here. Stock the farm to your winter grazing capacity, not your summer grazing capacity. And this is thinking in terms right now of cow-calf as being your centerpiece enterprise. If you set the cow herd based on what you can graze in the summer, which is what almost all farms and ranches do, is the stocking rate is set on summer carrying capacity, that almost guarantees that you're going to have the spring surplus growth that you're going to make into hay, and then you're going to feed that hay in the winter because there was nothing left after the summer grazing to allow winter feed to be out there. So this is the first key principle from the stocking standpoint of how to get to year-round grazing. Set the cow herd based on your winter grazing capacity. Most of you folks have some tall fescue on your place probably. Would that be right? All right. I always say there's 5 very good reasons for growing tall fescue. November, December, January, February, and March. Those are the 5 best reasons to have fescue around. And if you understand that concept, then fescue is a blessing, not a curse. Flexibility in stocking rate allows you to capitalize on when you have the most usable forage and reduce numbers or demand when you have lesser. That brings us to the concept of stock policy, which is the type of livestock and the number present at any given time. A lot of people, we run 50 cows. Grandpa ran 50 cows. I'm going to run 50 cows, and son, when you get to take this place over after I die and you're 58 years old and you've never been allowed to make a decision in your life, but when that time comes, you're going to run 50 cows because I'm going to be in my grave watching you, and by God, you better run 50 cows. It's just what we do. I'm not sure that's sensible management. So we're going to think about changing those things. We need to understand what the nutritional requirements of our livestock are. And this just takes the beef sector. And we probably have some dairy farmers here. We probably have some people with sheep, some goats, maybe. Anybody have bison? Okay, a lot of times we have 1 or 2 bison people in the outfit. Okay, so if we think about the nutritional demand within the beef sector, and we could rank out each of those other types of animals similarly, the highest energy demanding animal in the beef sector is finishing. And if we're finishing on pasture, which is what we've been doing for years, I like it. There's a lot of myths about it, and we could spend 2 days doing, pasture finishing, but that demands a lot of energy. To be able to have animals actually marble, lay down fat, and be USDA choice grade when we kill them, that takes energy. First calf heifer in the first 90 days of lactation is the next highest because this female is producing milk. She's still trying to grow. Plus, we want her to come back into estrus so we can get her bred 83 days after she dropped that first calf. So that takes energy. Stockers gaining over 2 pounds a day. Finally, we get to some cows. High milk-producing cows, moderate milk-producing cows, stockers under 2 pounds a day. And actually, probably here in the east, I should knock that down to 1.5 pounds rather than 2 pounds. Because 2 pounds is a high level of performance here for a sustained period. In the west, it's not. And then dry pregnant adults. So we have a huge demand from finishers to dry pregnant adults. We want to do our finishing when we have good quality cheap grass. When all we have is dead stockpiled grass, we want to have low energy demand. Pretty simple concept. And we already said this. Okay, the way, all right, so you said, all right, Jim, or dog, if you want to say, hey, dog. So if we're not going to make that spring flush into growth, what do we do with it? How do we manage it? This is this is what brought us into the custom grazing business. We started out initially as a cow-calf outfit. We carried our own stockers over and grazed them out as yearlings, but we didn't bring in any others because we made the decision that we're not going to cut hay in that spring peak anymore. We needed to do something with it, and that's when we started custom grazing. And the way we ended up being structured, about 60% of our total forage production went to sustain our cow herd. And the cow herd is there 12 months of the year. But we're grazing because we've planned ahead to have the number of animals appropriate so that we could graze through November, December, January, February, and March. And a lot of people say, well, how much of your cow herd do you have to get rid of if you're going to do this? If you change other aspects of your management, you may not have to reduce your cow herd at all. We dropped from about 75 cows to 55 to 60 cows. And then we concentrated 40%, or what the spring flush accounted for, and it goes into summer. It's really, for us, it was April to August 1st. 40% of our excess production took place in that time period, and so that 40% is what we put into the custom grazed animals. When all was said and done, you remember, I think I said earlier on, what's important is how many stock days per acre you end up harvesting. We actually harvested more total stock days in this configuration of stock policy, the combined cows and stockers, than we did when we were cutting the spring flush for hay and then feeding it to the cows in the winter. We actually increase, if you think of carrying capacity as the amount of forage produced that you get consumed, we actually increased our carrying capacity by eliminating hay and grazing all winter. Now, we had a pretty well-set strategy that we used to balance out our forage supply. We took the farm, divided it roughly into 3 units. We had 260 acres. And this 100 acres here has some timber through it, but they all had roughly the same amount of grazing area in it. And so if this were the piece of land that we were going to run the contract animals on this year, when they left around the 1st of August, those are the acres that we stockpile for cow feed. The cow herds, and we also had our own stockers besides what we custom grazed. So our own herds may have been using these 2 blocks all through the entire growing season. The custom animals grazed this April to August, then we stockpiled it, and so this is where the cows would winter. Next year, this would become the custom grazing area and the stockpile and wintering area. Third year, this would. I did not want to winter on the same ground 2 successive years. Biggest problem that we faced in winter grazing in Missouri is probably the same one that you face here, and that is mud. And if you winter on the same ground too often and you get trampling damage, that's where the weeds came from. If we wintered on it 1 year and then put it back into the growing season grazing component, we could manage the weeds on it just through grazing. It would heal up, thicken back up. So we only wintered on the same ground every 3rd year. And they were split up, and then we further strip grazed all these areas to get more use out of it. This is what custom grazing did for us. It added stocking rate without cash outlay. We did a couple of times, buy cattle and then sell them later in the season to get the added stocking rate. But if you do that, you have to have the money to be able to do that. And other than when we bought the land, we never borrowed money for any of our operations. Everything had to pay for itself as it went. It allowed us to keep spring pasture in check, eliminated making hay, so we took that whole cost component out of our business, and it provided the cash income for farm improvement. The stock water development, the subdivision fencing, I was making much slower progress on that than I really wanted to, just because I didn't have the funds to do it. when we were making hay and doing hay. As soon as we took hay out of our operation and turned that spring flush into cash income from livestock use rather than just creating another cost by putting it into hay, that gave us the cash in hand that then we could jump forward and we could do the liming, the stock water, the fence, everything that needed to be done. Calving season, tremendous impact on forage demand. Cows calving in the winter, I'll just say, I don't think it's a good idea. And we'll talk about some of the alternatives to winter calving. According to the calendar, these are the seasons. February is not spring calving. February is winter calving. To me, when you say spring calving, what I think you're saying is the cows are giving birth to calves on green growing pasture. To me, that's what spring calving is. You're calving on green grass. August is not fall calving, it's a summer calving deal. Fall calving doesn't start until in September. Why is this important? Because the highest energy demand that this cow is going to have occurs from just before calving till peak lactation. And we're looking at a 90 to 100 day period there. This graph here, and I have this cow calving in January just so we can read the calendar straight across. But this pattern, this cycle of nutrient demand is going to exist regardless of when and where you calve. This happens to be for a very specific cow. This is a 1,300 pound cow of moderate to superior milking ability. We all know that when you wean the calf off the cow, her requirements go down, and that's the low point of her nutrient demand. This January-born calf, we're going to wean it 1st of August, so that's when we have the lowest energy demand. The highest energy demand is going to occur at peak lactation. Cows typically hit peak lactation 45 to 65 days after calving. If you look at the low point, this particular cow's requirement was 23 pounds of forage a day. At the peak, it's 43. That's a 75 to 80% increase in nutrient demand just due to lactation. What that essentially means is if you have 100 cows and you look at this low level of demand at weaning, at peak lactation, you in essence have 175 to 180 cows on the place. So that big demand, wouldn't we rather have it out somewhere where we actually have a better forage supply? Well, I would. This is a lactation curve here. This is pounds of milk yield per cow per day. And this is straight bred Hereford cows right here, polled Herefords. You'll notice calving on March 1st, she hits peak lactation May 13th, and the peak's about 16 pounds of milk per head per day. The dark green line here, that's the pasture daily growth rate, and this growth line is for tall fescue fertilized with nitrogen. So it's a real spike in the spring, flat in the summer, some in the fall. When you have cows calving this early, and you have that rising energy demand due to lactation, all of that increased demand that occurs before green grass starts growing has to come from somewhere else. For most people, that somewhere else is hay. And hay is typically much lower quality than green grass, and it's also more expensive, which Greg's going to explore for us here in a little bit. So you're creating your highest demand at the time when feed is lowest quality and most expensive. If you think about it in a business aspect, does that make business sense? I don't think it does. If we move calving later to where, this is April 15th, to where the calves are born as the green grass is starting, we don't have that gap in demand when we don't have grass. So we can do it cheap, feed them much more cheaply in this situation here. But you look at this calving date of April 15th, when do the bulls need to go in? July 7th. What's a tall fescue environment in the southeast like on July 7th? Particularly if you're thinking about trying to get cows bred. It's not so good, is it? So maybe this is not the best strategy in a tall fescue environment. Let's think about in certain regions where timing of calving based on matching peak supply and animal demand together. Come out west to the northern plains, eastern Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming. It makes perfect sense to have cows calve in June. A lot of you have probably heard, and if you've attended this meeting, you may have heard Kit Farrow or some other people talking about calving in sync with nature. And they say, well, when do the deer have their babies? And they'll talk about May and June calving. And in some environments, that is absolutely the best time to be calving. Let's go down to East Texas, where winters are fairly mild. You can have winter annual forages, again, like rye, ryegrass, crimson clover, arrowleaf, stuff like that, growing most of the winter. Their best forage supply might be in March and April. So should they be calving in June when it's going to be super hot, humid, stressful, and doing it on low-quality Bahia grass? Probably not. Even though it's winter, it makes perfect sense to calve in January in East Texas because we have changed nature. We've changed nature because that type of forage is not native to East Texas. Out on our irrigated pastures in Idaho, May is probably the optimum time for us calving, but you don't care about those places. What about endophyte infected tall fescue in the southeast? What's the best time to calve? All right, fescue in the summer is not very healthy. I said the 5 best reasons for growing fescue are November, December, January, February, and March. Fall calving fits very well in this climate if you have mastered stockpiling tall fescue and utilizing it effectively. If all you're going to do is feed hay all winter, fall calving cows are going to cost you a whole lot more than spring calving cows are. But if you have mastered fescue, know how to use it as stockpiled pasture, calving at that time makes perfect sense because the safest time to use fescue and its highest nutrition is very often as stockpiled winter feed. So we're still matching peak demand with peak supply. Assess range and pasture resources, make the best use of each opportunity. You have to have that plan that allows you to defer use in the late summer and fall to create winter feed. If every acre you have is getting grazed in that window of time, you're not going to create winter feed. So summing this up, again, have a plan. Know what you want to accomplish, why you want to do it. Then you begin to figure out what do you have to work with. What are your land resources, your pasture resources, what infrastructure do you have in place? And J.B. Daniel is going to talk to us about infrastructure later on. And then you decide, what do you need for critters? What kind of animals? When do they need to be here? When do they need to leave? When do they need to calve? If you do all these things, you ought to be able to make it work. Now, in the I need to advertise real quickly here. In the Kick the Hay Habit book, I do admit that there are some places in the U.S. where year-round grazing is not going to work. The Great Lakes states, because the snow gets 14 feet deep at times. And I haven't met a cow yet who can graze at 14 feet of snow. The Pacific Northwest coast, because it rains so much, the ground just gets so soggy, it physically won't hold animals up in the wintertime. Areas in the northern Rockies and the northern plains, there are some pockets where there's too much snow and it's not going to work. But 80% of the land mass of the United States is in areas where 365-day grazing should be the norm, not the exception. Yes, you're going to get the snowstorm, you're going to have an ice storm, and maybe it's 350 days one year, maybe it's 320. But if you have that goal out there for 365, you will find a surprising number of times that it will accomplish. So as Robert had mentioned earlier, both of my books, Kick the Hay Habit and Management Intensive Grazing, the council has for sale out on the tables there. And then I have brochures for our business here. Besides coming around and telling stories like this, I do individual on-site consulting. And we have a retail product business that my wife handles, electric fence, stock water. If you want to pick up a brochure, if you're interested in our other services, I will actually move these out to the table there. Do we take any questions? I know I went long today. All right, questions, comments before we move along? Suddenly 3 hands go up at once. All right, let me come here. Yes, ma'am.
It may be answered later in the program. How do you get from what we're presently doing, maybe overgrazing pastures and...
Okay. How do you get from point A to point B? The question is, how do you get from where you are today to where you want to be? You get there by taking the first step and making some level of change. We are going to be talking about those things later this afternoon. But one of the first things you need to figure out is the number of animals that you have right now appropriate for what the farm will support? If you are grazed down to short grass and you're bringing in hay to feed for 150 days, you are just simply overstocked. You are going to have to reduce animal numbers to start bringing things back into balance. Now, you may find afterwards that you will end up running more animals than you have right now. We see that very often. But in that transition period, the pressure might just have to come off. First thing we do, and JB is going to walk through the process of creating a grazing plan. Once we have that plan, then we're going to start subdividing pastures and managing what we have. That if you don't go that step, you know, you're never going to get from where you are today to where you need to be. Because managing time in grazing is the critical factor there. I think there was another one over here. Yes?
The bar charts that you had that showed the dry matter requirements for a cow, does that include the calf as well?
Okay, the question, the bar chart that shows the demand of the cow, the bar chart that had the January calving and the peak and the valley, that is the cow herself. The calf's consumption is going to be on top of that, which brings up the important question is, at what age does a calf shift from being predominantly consuming milk to be predominantly consuming forage? And that's 80 to 90 days of age. At 80 to 90 days of age, most of the calf's nutrition is coming from the pasture, not from milk. The cow's demand is falling off. The calf's demand is going up. And what you, depending on the milking ability of the cow and the growth rate of the calf, that line may be, the combined cow and calf line may be slightly increasing, might be staying about the flat, but rarely does it actually trend completely downward. Ma'am?
How do you deal with drought?
How do you deal with drought? You know, that's another whole day workshop. The way you deal with drought is all of the things that we talk about for changing the basic way that you approach grazing. You cannot be in the middle of a drought and do something magical to fix it. Ain't going to happen. You can't drought-proof your farm. You can make it much more drought-resistant. 3 key things for making your land more drought-resistant. Maintain a litter layer that's dead plant material on the soil surface. I don't want to see dirt at any time in a pasture looking down. I don't want to see dirt. I want to see dead plant material covering the soil surface, but more so, I want to see green, living, you know, good stand density, good thickness of plants. You create those through sound grazing management. Those 2 products together are going to increase the organic matter of the soil. So our ultimate goal is increasing the organic matter content of the soil so that it's more sponge-like. It will absorb water. It'll hold water. We have to have the cover on the ground to keep the ground from heating up and evaporating water out. So that's the strategy to make your place more drought-resistant. Having a pasture inventory is a key strategy because it allows you to see that your inventory value, the amount of grass you have averaged over the whole farm, is going down. You might just standing and look and say, yeah, it hasn't rained lately, but it's still okay. But if you actually have an inventory and you see from in 2 weeks' time, your average inventory value, and it's in the heart of the growing season, has dropped by 15%, you're not going to see that with your eye. But your information can tell you that, and you can say, whoa, I'm starting to get in trouble here. Maybe I need to sell a few cull cows. Maybe I need to lengthen out my recovery period to try to grow some more cover while I still have the chance. But the inventory is a very powerful tool for looking out ahead and making those adjustments. I think we better take our break now.
Let's give a good answer, Jim.